the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford University. Reinvigorating gender equality in the 21st century.
So this talk today I think is particularly relevant because it's going to have us really focused on relationships across class boundaries and across ethnic boundaries as well. So a bit more about Cameron. Cameron is a sociologist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She got her PhD at Brandeis and her undergrad at UC Berkeley. We won't hold that against her, so welcome her here anyway. She's also an NIH-sponsored scholar in the Institute for Clinical and Translational Research at the University of Wisconsin Medical School with a research home at the Paul W. Carbone Cancer Center. Her research focuses on public-private care work transfers, including what she's going to be talking about today, the shift of child care to the market.
And I'm especially pleased to be speaking in this series about Beyond the Stalled Revolution, because I think that the tensions and the division of labor between working mothers and their child care providers are evidence of ways in which the movement of women into the workforce has stalled, showing both cultural and institutional lag behind the realities of lives of working families. So culturally, mothering ideals have not only stalled, but I actually think have gone on steroids. In particular, the expectation for educated and middle and professional class mothers, the ideas of what mothers are supposed to transmit to their children have just skyrocketed in the past decade, to the point where it's virtually impossible even for a stay-at-home mother to achieve these ideals, and really impossible for a working mother to live up to the expectations. So that's the cultural tension at work here. The institutional tension is that workplaces have not changed. When I was conducting the bulk of my research, 63% of mothers were working outside the home, but the average number of working hours for dual earner couples was 115 per week and has not declined significantly since then. And in fact, the declines that have come in the form of unemployment and underemployment, not in more reasonable working hours for full-time employed people. So, what I want to understand here then is, how do these tensions play out in relationships between working mothers and their child care providers? A long time ago, Arlie Hochschild said that the family was the shock absorber for changes in the economy. And I want to suggest here today that the working mother-child care provider relationship is the shock absorber for these kinds of conflicts between the culture of intensive mothering and this unyielding workplace. Well, it's part of the nanny's job requirement. First of all, it's to substitute for the mother while she is at work, forming a loving bond with children for up to 60 hours per week without threatening the mother's place as primary parent. So for the nanny, shadow motherhood involves simultaneously falling in love with the children in her care while erasing traces of her presence in their lives. Second, shadow mothering is based on the expectation that the nanny give the employer's children the social and intellectual stimulation that the mother imagines that she would have given them herself if she stayed home. The second expectation is increased by a fear of downward mobility and the need to transmit middle-class status through a working class or poor mother substitute. So the first problem was managing attachment, or at least the impression of attachment. One of the ways that mothers did this was to make the most of the time they had with their children by ensuring that it was quality time. Quality time was probably the buzz phrase that came up most frequently in my interviews. So, for example, Suzanne, an engineer, explained, quote, "I need to feel like I'm getting a lot of face time and bonding time with my daughter." She said she appreciated it when her husband suggested, "Why don't you go upstairs and play with the baby while I clean up the dishes?" But as a way of managing the understandable anxieties that Jessica had and most of the mothers I interviewed had, they wanted to make sure that the highest of high quality time occurred during their shift. And this was a cause for a lot of behind the scenes negotiation and some battles. The central problem faced by the parties was a misalignment of competing concepts of time. The mothers had to contend with the constraints of industrial time, the structure of their work lives, while nannies were able to adhere to baby time, in which the day was paced by their perceptions of the children's needs. So, since the workplace time schedules were typically rigidly defined, the working mothers I interviewed really needed help trying to fit their family time into the evenings. So we have here an image not of shared childcare, but of childcare arranged to emphasize and maximize time with the mother. Now, another reason why there were sort of these rigid schedules was that most of the mothers I interviewed had very little grounded knowledge of childbearing. For most of them, this child, their first child, was the first child that they had ever cared for. Over half had never babysat or cared for a young child prior to the birth of their first. So, and then even with their own children, their time was limited to nights and weekends. And by contrast, their childcare workers had been raising children for most of their lives. So this deficit in experience often made the mothers pretty insecure as supervisors, and then they sort of tended to overcompensate by structuring the day in a way that they imagined was what they would do if they were home themselves. I think this concern about the transmission of class status, or what Pierre Bourdieu has called cultural capital, or even habitus, and habitus is a class-based sort of natural way of being in the world, from how one talks, moves, to the innate sense of what is proper in a given situation, what is not. This transmission of habitus, I argue, is women's work. And in fact, it's hard work, and it's conscious work that mothers do. And here's where I sort of part ways with Leroux. She talks about the transmission of habitus as something that just happens naturally from parent to child and sort of second nature that doesn't require thought. But when a middle or professional class mother has to delegate the transmission of her class status through a working class or poor mother, this natural transmission has to be translated into work rules and monitoring guidelines. The biggest concern for the employers was not the safety or happiness of their children, but rather that their children be primarily attached to them and this transmission of class-based habitus. From the perspective of nannies, I was surprised that their biggest concern was not fair wages or working conditions, but what I called the recognition deficit. That is, their employer's failure to recognize the value of their skill, and more importantly, the value of their attachment to their children and their care. And so the most frequent resistance strategy among the nannies I interviewed was what I call out-mothering the mother, engaging in a competency contest over who could sacrifice the most for the child, a game that nannies often won because they were willing to trade wages for recognition or to stay longer in a job that they hated because they wanted to be there for the child. And finally, I think this shadow mother arrangement is self-defeating in a number of ways. It reinforces the notion that nuclear families should be self-sufficient, and that any involvement by loving adults outside of the family is a sign of parental failure, especially the mother's failure. It also reinforces the idea that the child is the product of the mother's labor. So in other words, how the child turns out is her responsibility. And for the nannies, it meant that the most rewarding aspects of their jobs, their attachment to the children and their care, is an aspect that they have to hide. That the nanny is one cog in the parent's overall child-rearing strategy, not a person with her own unique and valued relationship with the children in their care. If the demands for shadow mothering emerged out of an anxiety that came from being caught between, in this vice, if you will, between intensive mothering and intensive working, was it possible that if you sort of remove one of these two pressures, you might open up new ways of conceptualizing the division of childbearing labor among mothers, child care workers, and even fathers? So I did a second round of interviews, and I sought out two groups of employers. One, women who either had part-time or flex time or even flexi-place work. And the second, mothers who grew up in a culture where working mothers were the norm. So African-American women, I had some women in my study who were from China. And what I found was that these were, in fact, what we would call necessary but not sufficient conditions for creating what I called partnership relationships. And these relationships were entirely different from those in the majority of the study, in that they were characterized by a couple of things. First of all, autonomy for the nanny based on earned trust, two-way communication. What do you think? What do you think? Ready for solid foods? I'm not sure. And shared decision-making. One of the things that I suggest about this is why this might be for the part-time and flex-time working mothers was that they had met what I call their threshold of connection. One of my criticisms of the attachment literature in psychology is that it tends to look just at the baby side, as if the baby is the only one who needs attachment, and secondly, as if there's sort of a monolithic baby that has a monolithic attachment need, and you know what it is. And what I found in my interviews was that mothers also had a threshold of connection. That is to say, an amount of time that they spent with their children that made them feel secure in their attachment with their children. And that then made it possible to delegate care to others. There were some added aspects to these partnership relationships. In all of the other relationships that I studied, the mothers tended to calculate the nanny's earnings as a percentage of their own. Not a household expense, but they would say, I earn this much, and in order for me to justify working, then I can pay that much. And what I came to see was that there was a pattern where the nanny's earnings and workday were structured so that the earnings fit inside the mother's salary and the workday fit around the mother's workday. It was as if the rest of the household didn't exist. Whereas in these partnerships, the nanny's earnings were calculated as a household expense, like the mortgage or your healthcare bills or your car note. And finally, these relationships tended to include team parenting, including the father. So it wasn't the case that mothers and fathers co-parented and then there was this tension about the nanny. It was a situation where sort of mothers and nannies negotiated the relationship around mothering, and if the mother was able to sort of open that up to a partnership with the nanny, then it also opened up to the father. So, and finally, they tended to seek a long-term relationship with the nanny. A lot of the mothers, in fact, almost all the mothers I interviewed who hired au pairs, hired them precisely because they turned over every year. So as one mother said, that way I'm the constant, so that the au pairs come and go. So in the partnerships, they tended to sort of really want to find somebody that would be in the family for a long time.